The wind outside the lodge windows was howling hard enough to shake the glass. It was near midnight, and the snow was falling so thick that the porch lights only reached a few feet into the darkness. I was sitting behind the front desk, filling out the last lines of the logbook, when I heard the sharp, metallic sound of a key turning in a door that shouldn't have been unlocked. I looked up, and all I could see was the long hallway leading to the guest rooms, empty and still. The snow muffled everything outside, but that sound had been crisp, deliberate, like someone sliding a key into a lock that didn't belong to them. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere during a storm where the silence felt too heavy. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 years old when this happened, working the night desk at a mountain lodge in central Colorado. I'd taken the job after a difficult divorce, wanting a quieter life away from the noise of Denver. The lodge wasn't fancy, just a long, wood-framed building with 30 rooms, a lounge, with a fireplace and windows that looked out toward the tree line. Winters there could be brutal weeks of white silence, broken only by the occasional guest. I'd learned to enjoy it most nights. The emptiness felt almost protective, like the mountain itself was keeping me company. But some nights that silence pressed too close. The man checked in during a storm that had closed the pass and left our parking lot buried under drifts. He came in just after 10 o'clock while I was helping Len Turner, our maintenance man, shovel the walkway. He wasn't dressed for the weather, no scarf, no gloves, just a heavy coat buttoned all the way up and a hat pulled low. He didn't say much, only gave me his name as quiet and slid cash across the counter. No ID, no credit card, nothing written down but the number I gave him for the room. Len raised an eyebrow at me when the man carried his small suitcase upstairs, but we both let it go. In the off-season, you don't turn away paying customers, especially when the roads are closed. What unsettled me wasn't his silence, but the way he carried himself like he'd already memorized the place. His eyes flicked across the lobby over the stairwell toward the hallway with its faded carpet and humming soda machine. He didn't linger on any detail, but it was as if he'd been there before, mapping it all out in his head. I handed him the brass key to room 12, and he walked away without a word. The sound of his footsteps on the creaking stairs lingered long after the door closed behind him. Later, as the storm grew worse, Len and I sat near the fireplace, sipping coffee and listening to the wind. Around midnight, I heard the sound I mentioned earlier, that distinct click of a key turning in a lock. But when I walked the hallway, every door was closed and every handle untouched. The carpets muffled my steps, and the air smelled faintly of cedar polish, but nothing was out of place. I told myself it must have been the building shifting in the cold, though the sound had been too precise for that. At 2 in the morning, I made my rounds again, flashlight in hand. The power had flickered once, leaving the hall lights buzzing. When I passed room 12, I noticed the faintest line of light beneath the door, steady and pale, though I knew the lamps inside were the same dull yellow as in every room. I leaned closer, listening. For a moment, I thought I heard whispering, a steady murmur like someone reading aloud. But as soon as I adjusted my stance, the sound stopped. The light under the door winked out as though the lamp had been switched off the second I noticed it. I went back downstairs, unsettled. Len was repairing a loose tile near the lobby bathroom, but he looked up when I returned. "Thought I heard voices," I said quietly, and he gave me a long look before nodding. He'd been at the lodge nearly 20 years. He knew when to take things seriously. "Could have been the TV," he said finally, though his tone carried no conviction. The storm locked us in that night. No one else checked in, no phone calls came through, and the snow piled against the doors until only the main entrance could be opened. Around 3, I was writing in the logbook when I heard footsteps in the hallway above the lobby. They were measured slow, as if someone was pacing. But when I checked the registry, only 2 rooms were occupied, Len's in the staff wing and the stranger's in room 12. I climbed the stairs quietly, every board creaking under my weight. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with closed doors, shadows flickering where the wall sconces dimmed. The sound of footsteps stopped the moment I reached the top. I stood still, straining to hear until the silence pressed so hard against my ears it almost rang. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. Room 12's key was no longer in the door. Guests often left their keys hanging in the lock, too tired to put them on the nightstand, but this one was gone. Back at the desk, I opened the drawer where we kept spares, and my stomach turned. Room 12's duplicate was missing too. I hadn't given it to anyone. I was sure of that. I locked the drawer, told myself I'd check again in daylight, and tried to focus on my paperwork. But the thought gnawed at me. Someone else had a key to that room, and it wasn't me or Len. By morning, the storm had eased. Pale sunlight broke through thin clouds, and plows carved their way up the pass. I brewed fresh coffee and waited for the man from room 12 to come down for breakfast, but he never appeared. When checkout time passed, I went upstairs and knocked. No answer. Len used his master key to open the door, and what we found has stayed with me all these years. The room was empty. Bed, unslept suitcase, gone no trace of anyone having stayed the night at all. Except for one thing, the key to room 12 resting on the center of the desk. It wasn't the one I had handed him. That one was still missing. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people tilt their head and study you differently, like they're not sure if you're exaggerating or if you're just broken in some quiet way. I was 42, teaching English at Whitmore Academy, a prep school tucked into the wooded hills of upstate New York. The job had its perks: small classes, motivated students, and the kind of campus that looked borrowed from a college brochure. But what I remember most isn't the classroom. It's the basement theater, a place painted black from floor to ceiling, where the air always seemed too still. That's where everything happened. The fall play was Macbeth, directed by Ed Holloway. He had been with the Academy for more than 2 decades, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who believed theater was more than a performance. It was truth stripped bare. His reputation attracted students who wanted college recommendations or stage careers, and to them he was half mentor, half gatekeeper. I'd sat through his rehearsals before. They were intense, but never unsafe. That year, something was different. The students closest to him were Tyler Washington, Sophia Martinez, and Jaime Park. They were dedicated, bright kids, but still kids. One Thursday afternoon, Holloway asked them to stay late for what he called an immersion rehearsal. I was supposed to be grading essays, but I'd left some of my books in the drama office. That's how I ended up standing outside the black box door just as he locked it from the inside. The heavy bolt sliding into place echoed down the hall. At first, I thought nothing of it. Directors crave control. But then I heard the first gunshot. It rattled the ceiling tiles and sent plaster dust drifting into the hallway. By the time I pushed the door open with my master key, my heart was pounding hard enough to drown out reason. The scene inside was frozen chaos. Sophia was crouched against the wall, hands over her ears. Tyler was on the floor with blood dripping from his temple. Holloway stood center stage with a Glock in his hand, eyes glassy, muttering about passion and fear as if they were stage directions. He swung the gun toward me when I entered, and for a moment I thought I was finished. But his focus snapped back to the students almost immediately, like I was only a shadow in the wings. He barked at them to start the murder scene again, his voice cracking with a manic edge. They obeyed out of sheer terror, stumbling through lines they barely remembered. Each mistake made him more volatile. I should have run for help right then, but fear pinned me, and some misplaced sense of responsibility kept me rooted to the wall. I kept thinking if I stayed calm, maybe I could pull them all through it. Holloway paced like a restless animal, his footsteps scraping the stage floor. At one point, he demanded Tyler strike Sophia for real. Tyler refused, and Holloway pressed the barrel against his chest. That was when I realized we weren't in a rehearsal. We were in a trap. The minutes stretched into an hour. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air, mingling with sweat and fear. Holloway shouted about truth, about how students never understood real stakes. He wasn't the man I'd worked with for years. His words slurred. His pupils dilated, his movements jerky and unpredictable. Later, toxicology reports would reveal a cocktail of amphetamines and synthetic drugs. But in that moment, all we knew was that his mind had been hijacked. When Jamie fumbled a line, Holloway hurled his metal thermos across the stage, splitting the boy's lip. Blood speckled his shirt like part of the costume. Sophia was forced to crawl on hands and knees across the rough floor while Holloway counted down, promising to fire if she didn't make it in time. Tyler tried to shield the others, but each time he spoke up, the gun found him again. The cruelty wasn't theatrical, it was deliberate. Somewhere in the madness, the students began to understand they might outnumber him. Sophia inched closer to the lighting board. Jaime kept one hand near the pile of rehearsal props. Tyler, despite the wound on his head, positioned himself where he could move quickly. I realized then that I was the coward frozen by the door, while the kids quietly planned to survive. The blackout came suddenly when Sophia killed the lights. The room plunged into absolute darkness. 2 shots tore through the black, the muzzle flashes briefly, illuminating faces twisted in panic. I dropped to the ground, ears ringing, waiting for the next shot. Instead, I heard the solid crack of wood on bone. Jaime had found his mark with a prop sword. The gun clattered across the floor, and in the dim, emergency glow, I saw Tyler tackle Holloway. They struggled, rolling over splintered chairs, the older man clawing at his throat. Sophia scrambled to restore a sliver of light, just enough to reveal the desperate scene. Tyler's face was turning purple under Holloway's grip. Without thinking, I grabbed a sandbag from the rigging equipment and brought it down. The sound was sickening, but it broke his hold. Holloway collapsed, blood streaking his forehead. The students didn't celebrate. They didn't even speak. They moved like survivors, dazed but efficient. Sophia tied strips of costume fabric around Tyler's neck to keep him breathing. Jaime pried the gun farther away with a crowbar he'd found. I stood, trembling, finally forcing myself to the intercom to call for help. static answered. It took the janitor alerted by distant gunshots to fetch bolt cutters and break open the door. Security and paramedics flooded the theater. They carried Holloway out on a stretcher, his pulse faint but steady. The rest of us sat wrapped in shock blankets under the buzzing fluorescent lights. In the weeks that followed, the school hushed the incident as much as it could. Holloway slipped into a coma and awoke with no memory of what he'd done. The students bore scars that didn't heal with time. Tyler needed surgery for his throat and never played football again. Jaime carried the lip scar like an unwanted badge. Sophia developed a fear of closed rooms that haunted her for years. I left teaching within the year. The part that clings to me isn't the violence or the gunshots. It's the way Holloway spoke in those last minutes, as if we were nothing but parts in his production. He demanded authenticity, and for a few terrifying hours, he got it. I still dream about the black box theater. In the dream, the lights are always dim, and I can still hear his voice demanding we start again. Back in the fall of 2022, I thought I was finally getting my life together. My apartment was the first place I'd lived alone. No roommates, no shared bills, just me and a rescue cat. The job at a small design agency wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for the first time since college, I felt like things were moving in the right direction. That was the backdrop when I made the mistake of downloading a dating app. It started out simple. My best friend, Chloe, had been urging me for months, telling me I was too young to be hiding away every evening with frozen dinners and reruns. Just try it, she'd said. What's the worst that could happen? I still hear her voice when I think back, because she had no idea how far that question would reach. The man's name was Nathan Crawford, or at least that was what he called himself. His profile looked different from the usual half-hearted pictures you scroll past. He wore a suit in one photo, rock climbed in another, and smiled with that careful kind of confidence that draws you in without feeling pushy. His bio was light-hearted but clever, something about logistics, software, bad cooking, and good wine. At the time, it made me laugh. Our first date was coffee on a Saturday afternoon. I'd expected a polite hour of conversation before awkward excuses, but we stayed 4. He leaned in when I talked, remembered the smallest things I said, and brought me a small succulent in a hand-painted pot. Nobody had ever done something like that on a first date. It seemed thoughtful, in a way that caught me off guard. When he asked to see me again the very next day, I didn't hesitate. Over the next weeks, Nathan created a rhythm that felt like a fairy tale drawn in everyday details. Flowers arrived at my office every Monday. Text messages came. Every morning at 7:15 sharp, never a minute off. Dinner reservations appeared out of nowhere, and weekend trips felt like something lifted from the lives of people richer than me. My coworkers called him Prince Charming, and even my cat, who hissed at every past boyfriend, climbed straight into his lap. It was intoxicating. I let myself believe I'd found the kind of man people wait for years to meet. When he talked about his business, Streamline X, a logistics software company, he spoke with polished conviction, tossing around technical words I didn't fully understand, but felt impressed hearing. He introduced me to his business partner, Jordan, over video call once, though the man barely spoke and kept his camera at an odd angle. At the time, I didn't think twice. The first crack showed one ordinary Wednesday when my credit card was declined buying lunch. When I checked the statement, there were charges I didn't recognize, all high-end electronics stores. I panicked, but before I could call the bank, Nathan messaged me, apologizing. He'd grabbed my card by mistake, used it for company equipment, and already transferred the money back. He sent a screenshot of the transfer, and the money really did show up in my account the next day. He even booked me a spa weekend to apologize. It seemed clumsy, but forgivable, and I told myself mistakes happen. Still, I saved that screenshot, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. The unraveling came weeks later. One quiet Thursday night. He had canceled dinner plans, claiming an emergency investor meeting. I was home alone, restless, waiting for takeout when I searched his company name online. Nothing came up. Not a website, not a LinkedIn page, not a trade article. For a man who bragged about contracts and expansions, it was as if the company didn't exist. I dug deeper, reverse searching his photos. Within minutes, the confident man in the tuxedo appeared on someone else's Instagram, and the rock-climbing shot turned out to be a stock image. My stomach turned cold. Every detail he'd ever given me suddenly felt fragile, like glass cracking under its own weight. That night, I discovered I wasn't alone. On a forum for scam victims, I found a thread where women described meeting a man who seemed almost identical. Same polished stories, same routines, same sudden vanishing acts. His name shifted each time. In Atlanta, he was Blake Summers. In Dallas, Ryan Foster. In Nashville, Christopher Lang. Each woman's account was like holding a mirror to my own life. Only their stories ended with drained bank accounts, ruined credit, and in one case, a drink laced with something she never agreed to. I sat in my apartment staring at the expensive purse he had bought me, wondering if it, too, was just another layer of the performance. When my phone buzzed with a message, "Missing you tonight, beautiful," I felt nauseous. The man on my screen wasn't Nathan Crawford. He wasn't even the collection of names I'd read online. He was something else, a shape that slid between identities like slipping on jackets. The following days blurred together in fear. I cut contact completely, blocked him. Everywhere, changed my locks, even alerted my building manager. But silence didn't sit well with him. The texts shifted from charm to anger. Some were long apologies, begging for forgiveness, while others threatened that I'd regret treating him this way. My hands shook each time my phone lit up with an unknown number. Then came the discovery that pushed me into true panic. In the lining of that expensive purse, I found a small tracking device, a thin disc I recognized as an AirTag. He hadn't just been giving me gifts. He'd been monitoring where I went. The police listened politely when I showed them, but their answers were all the same. Unless money was stolen or direct harm done, there wasn't much they could pursue. Every woman who had gone before me had heard the same lines, and most of them had been left carrying debts and shame. I spent 3 weeks moving between friends' apartments, never sleeping in the same place twice. I barely ate, barely worked, existing in a constant hum of tension. Then word came through the group of victims I had joined. He'd been arrested in Phoenix, trying the same routine with another woman, only she had recorded everything, conversations, screenshots, even confessions about how he chose his targets. He was sentenced to 5 years. With good behavior, that means less than 3. That fact hangs heavier on me than the months I spent looking over my shoulder. Because men like him don't change. They pause, they wait, and they return wearing different faces. I still have the small succulent he gave me that first night, though. It died long ago. The pot sits on my windowsill, cracked from a fall. Sometimes when I catch sight of it, I feel the same cold realization I felt that Thursday night, the moment I understood that the man I had trusted wasn't a person at all, but a collection of lies sharpened into a weapon. And what unsettles me most isn't that he tricked me. It's knowing that somewhere when his time runs out, he'll step into the world again, carrying a new name, smiling the same careful smile, already searching for his next audience. The last real job I had before everything fell apart was at a marketing firm in downtown Cincinnati. I was 24, fresh out of college and proud of landing a position that made me feel like a real adult. The office had the casual startup energy people my age were chasing, then ping pong in the break room, cold brew on tap, and coworkers who lingered after hours, like the place was a second home. That's where I met Gregory Lawson. He was in his early 30s, sharp dresser, perfect hair, the kind of man who never seemed to wrinkle under pressure. Gregory had a way of making you feel singled out, like whatever you said mattered more than anyone else's. From my very first week, he remembered how I took my coffee and left it on my desk before I even arrived. He praised my work in team meetings and stayed late to help me polish presentations. At first, it felt like mentorship. Then it began to feel like something heavier, like each kindness had a string attached that tightened a little more each day. I noticed the sulking when I grabbed lunch with other coworkers instead of him, or the sharp edge behind compliments about how dedicated I was for staying late with him when others left on time. I told myself I was overthinking. New jobs make you sensitive. But then came the night in March when he cornered me in the supply closet. I was reaching for printer paper when he blocked the door with that same smile everyone in the office trusted. His words, however, were different. He said I owed him for everything he'd done, that I was leading him on by accepting his help. His hand closed around my wrist firm enough to leave no marks, but hard enough to send a message. I managed to pull away and walked out, my pulse hammering so loudly I thought the others in the hall might hear it. The next morning, I went straight to my supervisor, Janet. She took me seriously more than I expected and had me write a detailed statement. Security footage confirmed he had followed me into the supply room. By Monday, Gregory's desk was cleared, and an email announced he was no longer with the company. I thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks later, the first email came. The subject line read, "You destroyed me." The address was a meaningless string of letters and numbers, but the message was short and chilling. "You ruined my career, my reputation, my life. But I know where you live. I know your routine. I know that pathetic dog you walk every morning at 6:15. You'll pay for what you did." I stared at the words, rereading them until my hands shook. The mention of Biscuit, my rescue mutt, made it impossible to dismiss. Only someone watching me closely would know that detail. Janet told me to file a report. Officer Brenner, the man who took it, barely looked up from his notepad. He told me anonymous emails were almost impossible to trace, advised me to change my passwords, vary my routine, and call if things escalated. The word escalated clung to me the rest of the day. That weekend, I bought a doorbell camera and started walking Biscuit at random times, circling extra blocks, watching reflections in storefront windows. But paranoia turned to certainty when I found my car in the office garage Monday morning. The entire driver's side was gouged with one word carved in deep scratches: liar. The security guard called it in, but the cameras covering that section had malfunctioned over the weekend. The emails became daily after that. Always from new addresses, always in the same voice. I see you changed your route. Cute blue dress today. Trying to impress someone new. Each message confirmed I was being followed, watched from angles I didn't detect. I stopped meeting friends for dinner, stopped sleeping through the night. Every sound outside my apartment had me sitting up with my heart pounding. The breaking point came in early April. I had stayed late at the office, more out of fear of being home alone than dedication to work. At 8:30, I walked into the nearly empty garage. The air smelled of oil and damp concrete, and my footsteps echoed louder than I expected. Halfway to my car, I heard another set, slow, deliberate, keeping pace with mine. I sped up. The steps quickened. My breath came fast, and I fumbled with my keys. Then I heard running. I spun around, pepper spray clutched in my hand, but saw nothing, just shadows stretching between pillars. That was when I noticed the paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. Stop hiding behind cameras. Let's settle this face to face. I drove home, shaking, locked every window, and slept with Biscuit curled at my side. But the true violation came the next night. Around 3 a.m, Biscuit's growling woke me. He almost never growled. I stumbled into the living room and saw my laptop glowing on the coffee table. A document was opened that I hadn't created. A single sentence was typed over and over, filling the page. "You can't hide from me." My stomach dropped. Someone had been inside my apartment while I slept. The spare key I kept under a fake rock by the door was missing. I called 911 and locked myself in the bathroom with Biscuit until officers arrived. They found no sign of forced entry, just my own lock betrayed by my carelessness. The next day, I had the locks changed, left Biscuit with my parents, and tried to convince myself the worst was over. But driving back from the locksmith, a black sedan slipped into my rear-view mirror. It followed me for miles, keeping the same distance, mimicking every lane change. When I sped up, it sped up. When I signaled an exit, so did it. Then, with a sudden burst, it clipped my bumper, sending my car spinning. I caught the guardrail just in time, but the sedan was already disappearing down the ramp. This time, the police believed me. Traffic cameras caught the plate. It led back to a rental car paid for with a prepaid card, but security footage at the counter told the story. I didn't need the grainy image explained. I recognized the way he stood, the pressed shirt, even at a rental counter, the impatient tapping of his fingers. It was Gregory. They found him in a motel outside the city. Inside his room were piles of printouts, my social media photos, notes on my routines, logs of my movements down to the minute. He had created 17 different email accounts to harass me, each more venomous than the last. Drafts on his laptop detailed what he planned to do once he finally got me alone. He was arrested that day, charged with stalking harassment and attempted vehicular assault. He pled guilty, avoided a trial, and was sentenced to 3 years. With good behavior, he could be out sooner. I moved to a different city, changed jobs, and spent months in therapy, learning to trust my own instincts again. The part that lingers isn't the scratched car or the laptop messages. It's how normal he seemed before. For 8 months, I laughed over coffee with him, let him guide my career, thought of him as one of the good guys. That's what still haunts me. The realization that predators don't always come, cloaked in menace. Sometimes they arrive in tailored suits with warm smiles, waiting for the moment you mistake their attention for kindness. And even now, years later, I still check behind me during every walk with Biscuit, half expecting to see him standing just out of reach, smiling like nothing ever happened. I used to think the worst part of running a warehouse overnight was the silence. Forklifts idle in their bays, pallets stacked higher than a man could see, everything lit in that pale industrial glow that makes time feel like it isn't moving. You could hear your own breathing carry across the concrete floor. For years it was just me and a skeleton crew, the same guys I'd known long enough to trust. That changed when corporate sent us Wesley Grant. Wesley was 23, wiry, with a mop of dark hair and an awkward laugh that never quite matched his eyes. He said he'd worked security before, though he never said where. He shook my hand a little too long when we first met, and I remember thinking he was nervous, just another kid trying to prove himself. I assigned him to the back dock, figuring he could get comfortable with the quieter end of the floor. At first, nothing stood out beyond small things. He never took his breaks at the same time as anyone else. He asked strange questions like whether we had blind spots in the cameras or if the alarms could be shut off manually. When I joked about him planning a heist, he didn't laugh. He just stared at me until I looked away. 2 weeks in, I started catching him in places he had no reason to be. Once, he was in the office supply closet long after his shift had started, claiming he was just looking for tape. Another time, I found him standing in the middle of the darkened break room, staring at the vending machines, as if he'd forgotten why he was there. The cameras picked him up, wandering the aisles at hours, when he should have been scanning shipments. He never stole anything, never touched a thing, he just drifted. Then came the night I stayed over past my shift. A truck was late, so I told Wesley to lock up and left him with the final checks. I got halfway down the highway before realizing I'd left my phone on my desk. By the time I turned back, the building was empty except for his car. Inside, all the lights were off. My footsteps echoed through the dark like I'd broken into my own job. When I reached the loading dock, I found him crouched behind a stack of pallets, whispering to himself. I didn't catch the words, but I remember the way his shoulders jerked when he realized I was there. He stood too fast, knocking over a broom, and his smile was stretched thin. He said he was making rounds, though there was no reason for him to be hiding. I wrote it off as nerves, but the next week broke whatever excuses I had left. One of the guys came to me saying he caught Wesley with the master keys standing outside the locked cage where we kept high-value electronics. He claimed Wesley said he was just testing them. Later that night, security footage showed him walking the perimeter fence, checking the padlocks with his hands like he was memorizing them. I pulled him into the office, asked him straight out what he was doing. His expression didn't change. He told me calmly that he was keeping the place safe, that he knew how people worked, that he could spot the ones who didn't belong. When I reminded him that he was the new one here, his eyes narrowed and he said, "You'd be surprised what people hide from you." I filed a report with HR the next morning, but the system dragged its feet. The night after, everything came to a head. Around 2 a.m., the alarm tripped in the west wing. I ran there with 2 others and found Wesley already inside, flashlight beam sweeping the walls. The strange thing was the alarm had been set off from the inside, not the doors. And when I asked how he got there so fast, he just shrugged. We combed the place, but found nothing disturbed. No footprints, no broken locks. But in the far corner behind a stack of shipping crates was a folding chair. On the seat was a legal pad filled with cramped handwriting. At the top of the page, in neat block letters, it read, "The Patterns." Underneath were lists of employee names, shift times, and bizarre notes about who left early, who spoke to whom, and which routes each of us drove home. My name appeared more than any other. I didn't let on how unsettled I felt. We all left together that morning, but I stayed behind waiting until he drove off. Then I called the police. Officer Brewster came out, listened to the story, and promised to speak with him. When we opened his locker, we found dozens more pages, like the one on the chair, all filled with observations about every one of us. What we wore, how often we blinked, which days we looked tired. None of it made sense, except for the sheer obsession behind it. The company fired him immediately, but that didn't end it. 2 weeks later, I got home from another long shift and found an envelope under my door. Inside was a single page written in the same neat block letters. It said only this: "I was right about you. You leave at 6:17 every morning. You always stop at the same gas station. People notice more than you think. The police told me it wasn't enough to act on. No threats, no signature, just words on a page. But I still drive different routes home now, years later. Sometimes I catch myself looking into the warehouse shadows on old security tapes, half expecting to see him there, crouched low, waiting for me to notice. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those nights that sits heavy in your memory, quiet until something stirs it up, and then it's like you're back there, all over again. I was 34 at the time, working nights at a diner off the highway outside Springfield. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady, and I liked the quiet rhythm of it. Coffee pots hissing, neon buzzing outside the windows, and the occasional hum of a truck pulling into the lot. It was just past 2 in the morning when he came in. A tall man in a gray overcoat, clean-shaven, carrying nothing but a folded newspaper under his arm. He didn't sit right away. He lingered by the door, scanning the booths as though he expected to recognize someone. Finally, he slid into a seat against the far wall and folded his hands neatly on the table. He didn't look tired the way most late-night customers do. He looked like he was waiting. I walked over with the usual smile and a menu, but before I could ask what he wanted, he said my name. Not ma'am or miss, but Rebecca. I froze for half a beat because my name tag wasn't on. I'd lost the pin earlier that week and hadn't replaced it. When I asked how he knew, he didn't answer. He just tilted his head like it was a silly question and said, "You're not supposed to be here." I laughed it off, told him I'd been working there for years. But he shook his head. "Not here. You're supposed to be in Kansas City. You had the house on Olive Street with the little fence. Your dog's name was Lucky." His voice was calm, measured, and utterly certain. The thing was, none of that was true. I had never lived in Kansas City, never owned a dog, never even been on Olive Street. Yet the way he said it with those steady eyes locked on mine, I felt a chill crawl up my arms. It didn't sound like a guess. It sounded like memory. I tried to redirect him, asked what he wanted to eat. He ordered black coffee and apple pie, nothing unusual. But the whole time I poured his cup, I could feel him watching me like I was someone he'd been searching for. When I set the plate down, he said softly, "You changed your hair since then. I liked it better long." Carl the line cook noticed my face when I came back to the counter. I whispered that the man was creeping me out, but Carl shrugged it off, said drifters pass through at night and sometimes they talk strange. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Each time I glanced back, the man wasn't eating, wasn't drinking. He was just staring like he was cataloging every detail of me for later. When the diner finally emptied out just past 3, he was still there. I told him we were closing early for maintenance, hoping to move him along. He stood, smoothed his coat, and gave me this smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't go out the south door," he said quietly. "He'll be waiting in the lot." I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't told him I parked on the south side, but I had. My old Chevy was sitting right there in the glow of the sodium lamps. I asked who he meant, but he just shook his head again as if it was obvious. Then he walked out the north exit and disappeared into the dark without another word. Carl didn't like it either. He grabbed the big kitchen flashlight and walked me to my car. The lot was empty. No one waiting, no shadows moving. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood straight until I pulled out and drove home. The next day, I told Officer Ramirez, who sometimes stopped by for coffee, and he listened carefully. Turned out, I wasn't the first. Other women had reported a man matching the description showing up at gas stations' diners, and even a church service always calling them by the wrong name, always reciting details of lives that weren't theirs. He never touched anyone. He never threatened. He just knew things. Things that weren't true, but felt like they could have been. I never saw him again. But every so often, usually late at night when the diner is empty and the neon hums against the windows, I catch myself wondering, what if he wasn't wrong? What if there's another version of me somewhere living on Olive Street with a dog named Lucky, and he just mistook me for her? Or worse, what if he didn't mistake me at all, but saw something I'm not supposed to know yet? That thought is harder to shake than the memory of his eyes. I once spent a night in Abilene, Kansas while driving between appointments. I didn't plan to stay there. I just got too tired to make it farther and pulled into a small roadside motel with a flickering sign that read, "Vacancy." The building had the kind of quiet wear you only notice when you're alone. Paint peeling from the railings, blinds drawn tight in every window, and a silence so complete that even the sound of my tires on the gravel lot felt too loud. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish. The woman at the desk, who introduced herself as Mrs. Whitaker, handed me a brass key on a chipped wooden fob. She warned me that the second-floor hallway lights sometimes went out after midnight, but said not to worry, they always came back eventually. I didn't think much of it. Tired as I was, all I cared about was a bed and 4 walls. My room was clean enough, though the carpet felt damp under my shoes, and the air conditioner rattled as though it hadn't been touched in months. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, and let the TV glow against the walls while I made a couple of calls. Around 1 in the morning, I switched everything off and lay staring at the ceiling, half listening to the hum of the unit and the distant highway. That's when the knocking began. It wasn't sharp or hurried, Just 3 slow, deliberate knocks against my door. I waited expecting another round, but none came. I told myself it must have been someone mistaking the room, maybe a drunk looking for the wrong number. I was about to drift again when it came back 3 more knocks, spaced the same way, steady and patient. I sat up, every hair on my arms rising. I checked the peephole, but the hallway was empty. The light outside my door was buzzing dimmer than before. I waited, hand on the knob, but something in me decided not to open it. Instead, I spoke through the door, asked what they wanted. No answer. Just silence, followed by another 3 knocks, exactly the same. I called down to the lobby, but the phone rang and rang without answer. That's when I remembered Mrs. Whitaker's warning about the lights. I opened the curtains thinking I might see movement in the lot, but it was deserted. The gravel shimmered in the orange glow of a single pole lamp, and nothing stirred. I sat back on the bed, heart thudding when the knocking returned again. Same rhythm. 3 knocks, followed by silence. I turned the TV on for noise and sat awake, watching the minutes creep past. Around 2, I finally opened the door. The hallway was darker now, the ceiling fixtures clicking faintly as they fought to stay lit. At the far end, I thought I saw a figure standing by the ice machine. He didn't move, didn't approach, didn't even look in my direction, just stood perfectly still as if listening. I shut the door, locked it again, and waited for dawn. The knocking stopped soon after, but the silence that replaced it felt heavier, like the motel itself was holding its breath. When the sun finally pushed through the thin curtains, I packed my things and headed out. Mrs. Whitaker was back at the desk, cheerful as though nothing had happened. I asked if anyone else had been staying near my room. She checked the ledger, frowned, and told me I'd been the only guest on the 2nd floor that night. I wanted to press her further, but she seemed certain. As I drove away, I looked back at the building in my mirror. Every curtain was pulled tight, every window blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had opened that door just once more, something would have stepped inside. That was the last story I'll share tonight. Thinking back on these accounts, what strikes me isn't the noise or the shadows, but the quiet. It's the silence in those rooms, the pauses in those hallways, the way the world itself seems to hold still when something isn't quite right. All of these places, the motels, the diners, the empty roads, were supposed to be ordinary. They were built for travelers, for passing nights and forgettable hours. Yet they've stayed in memory far longer than the towns I drove through in daylight. Perhaps it's because the ordinary has no reason to unsettle you, and when it does, it lingers. I've come to believe that the scariest things are rarely the loudest. They're the moments that slide by without explanation. A voice that knows your name. A figure waiting at the edge of the light. A knock that comes again and again until you can't ignore it anymore. Maybe you've had moments like that yourself, small ones, brushed aside, but still sharp in memory years later. That more than anything else is why these stories stay with me. Thank you for listening, all the way to the end. I hope these stories kept you company tonight wherever you are. If you'd like to hear more, please follow the channel. Share this with a friend and subscribe for future nights. And tell me, have you ever stayed somewhere that felt wrong in ways you couldn't explain?